Good afternoon, everybody. Joe Lucey here, President, Founder of Secure Retirement Financial, and I want to thank you for joining us here for this week's Market Huddle. Um, as I was thinking about this here, I have a client. His name is Mike. Mike is a pilot for Delta Airlines, a retired pilot here. And a couple years back, Mike gave me a checklist for a 757 Delta Airlines airliner. And, on this checklist, what I found interesting was there was a checklist for, hi Scott, checklist for things like takeoff, things that were routine like landings. There were even checklists on here for crisis, those things that could go wrong that weren't necessarily certain. So what do we do if there's an illness on board, or if there's a problem with landing gears and things like this. So as I started thinking about this a couple years back, I said, we need a checklist for our retirement. And so we developed this 14-point checklist. It's something that we bring our clients through. And I, just like a Delta pilot who's entrusted with hundreds of lives on every single flight, this is a checklist that I think everybody should include in their retirement planning. So whether you are a current client of ours, or if you are a referred client or somebody, that prospective client that was referred this or forwarded on this webinar from one of our other clients, or maybe that you've been in our database and you get an email from us once a week, and you've been attending these webinars for a couple weeks now, going back to March 23rd when we hit the market bottom after the COVID crisis and everybody was going home. I encourage you to download at the end of today's huddle this checklist. It's a 14-point checklist. Not every 14 points on this checklist is something that everybody's going to want to necessarily spend a lot of time in their planning on, but I assure you that every 14 points on this checklist is something that you should be including, or at least have a discussion in your retirement planning, whether or not you decide to spend a lot of time in it. So you'll see what I mean. But so for example, there's a legacy risk, right? How much are we going to leave to our family here? Some families find a legacy risk as something that they is super important to them. They'd eat ramen noodles to make sure the kids have more. In retirement, most families say kind of, hey, this money is for us, but if there's something left over, we don't want to leave a mess. And then we have clients that maybe are less concerned about where that money goes. But regardless of where you sit in the spectrum there, you want to have spend some time with an advisor, go through this risk, and decide how important it is to you or not. So anyways, with that said, I'm going to pull up the slides here in just a second. And I will delete. I'll turn my video off here as we go through this, and then at the end we'll probably bring it back in. So this is the 14 risks that all retirees need. Keep in mind, we try to keep these presentations to about 15 minutes, which means, boy, I'm going to be rushing through these a little bit at the end of today's presentation. Should you decide you'd like 15 to 30 minutes with a member of our team to review any or all of these risks in your own retirement planning, I encourage you to do so. And again, in a little bit, I'm going to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to download these 14 risks so that you can review them at your leisure. So I'm seeing that Kay, I hope Kay was able to get back on. If not, we'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of the presentation afterwards. And again, this is something that I encourage you to send on to somebody else that you that is considering doing some retirement planning, and make sure that they too address these 14 risks. So here we are. Here's the disclaimer that my attorneys make us put in there. Keep in mind, we're going to talk about some things. We may talk a little bit about taxes. We might talk a little bit about legacy planning or estate planning. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a CPA, but I am a certified financial planner, and we believe in a comprehensive retirement plan. That means that we understand that income planning, investments, taxes, they're all important. It's not just about a wealth strategy alone, and you'll see that as we go through these 14 risks. So let's jump into the top couple here. Number one, longevity risk. This one here is kind of the granddaddy of them all. The longer we live, the more likely some of these other risks are going to come into play. I can't think of anything worse than being 85 years old, chock full of life, and dirt broke. You got to make sure that we have the ability to make our retirement plan last as long as we do. One of the stress tests or litmus tests that I think we all should consider, what if me and my spouse both live to 120? Will there be enough? Forbes magazine tells us that longevity risk for anybody that is at the age of 65, if a married couple comes in my office, they're both 65, there is a 50-50 probability, a coin flip, that one of the two partners are going to live past the age of 92. When you think about that, if I'm retiring at 62, that means that money should expect to last us at least 30 years. In fact, there's a 1 in 4 chance that one partner is going to live to the age of 96. So we need to make sure that we have 30, 35, maybe even 40 years worth of retirement assets available to us as we go into retirement. And longevity risk is something you need to be addressing in your retirement planning. Again, it's not just about the investment strategies. It's how do I take this money back, make it last a lifetime, and that's longevity risk. Number 2, excessive withdrawal risks. Money Sense is another resource we use from time to time. And they had an article talking about the 4% rule. And back in 1996, a guy by the name of Bill Bengen, he was a certified financial planner, like myself, published this Journal of Financial Planning article where he'd done some research going back to 1926. And he said, if I need my money to last 30 years in retirement, what's a safe withdrawal rate? Well, he came back with this 4% rule. Here's the problem. I still use that same analogy. And in a low interest rate environment, because if you go back to that test, it said that 4% was the rule. If I had 60% of my money in stocks, 40% in bonds, that means that 40% of my money is in fixed income, and I'm no longer getting 6, 7, 8% like we were back in the 90s. Another gentleman by the name of Wade Fowle ran another similar study, took Bill Bengen's original study, redid it based on today's market environment. He shows us that now we have a 50% failure rate in this 4% rule. Where am I going with this? Keep in mind that we got to be careful that we aren't taking our money out too quickly or carelessly. You need a plan in place. And one of the ways that we can help you protect that is making sure that you never have a market value adjustment exposure. Market pulls back due to something we never saw coming, such as like maybe COVID. I visited with hundreds of families, had lots of phone calls. I've never met anybody that said that they saw this COVID crisis coming here back in December, back in November. Few said that, yeah, they realized it was starting to peak up in January, but most of us were blindsided. We didn't see it coming. Well, imagine having to take a certain amount of money out of our retirement accounts when the market is down 34%. That's market value adjustments. And we need to have a plan in place in our retirement planning so that we are not forced to take obligations or pay obligations out of money that's exposed to market risk. We talk a lot about mailbox income, money that I can take regardless of what's going on Wall Street. What's the third risk? We all need to be looking at investment risk. This is closely associated to risk number 2, the excessive withdrawal risk, but goes beyond that. It's about making sure that we have proper diversification, proper asset allocation. When it comes to risk in investment risk in retirement, risk is a 4-letter word. And if you are taking on too much risk in your retirement, you can absolutely decimate the income coming forward. In fact, an Allianz study says that 49% of all families, almost half of us, have concerns. That's the biggest risk that we've identified for ourselves with our current retirement planning. If you have questions about investment risk, if you're not addressing this in the planning that you currently have, or you'd like to review the planning that we have around this risk, let's schedule 15 to 30 minutes to discuss it. Sequence of returns risk. They tell us that the number, it's the risk that you end up retiring early in retirement into a down market. Studies can be shown where we have somebody that retired prior to the 2000, 2001, 2002 pullback, and then somebody else that retired in 2002 at the market bottoms. The market bottom retiree that retired 2 years into the downturn that had enough going into retirement was far better off than somebody that retired in 2000 and experienced massive losses. So we got to be careful that we aren't taking on too much risk. It's the risk here of a retiree retiring into a down market. And if the stock market is falling during the first few years of retirement, this combination of stock market losses and your need to withdraw money can absolutely destroy a retirement plan. So we got to go beyond just which are the right investments for us, addressing sequence of returns risk. In fact, I tell families early in retirement, you should probably be in the lowest risk than even somebody that's 80 or 85 or 90 years old. In fact, somebody that's retiring at 65 should be at the lowest risk of their entire, when you're in your 30s, you take more risk. 40s, you start to reduce. 50s, you might reduce it more. When you're 65, if you're retiring at 65, that's where you want to have the least amount of risk. And then actually, as time goes on, let's increase it back up. But early in retirement, we got to protect ourselves from sequence of returns risk. Ask yourself, if you look at your retirement planning, have you addressed sequence of returns risk? Asset allocation risk, owning different kinds of assets that may not necessarily be exposed to market risk, having other investments that aren't tied necessarily to Wall Street. Think of alternative investments, things like maybe commodities, oil and gas, precious metals, corn futures. I mean, there's these different assets that are not necessarily tied to the S&P 500. Good example is my house doesn't give a rip what's going on with Wall Street right now. Wall Street's on a tear. We know that. It doesn't mean that our house is all of a sudden worth that much more just because the S&P 500 is up 250 points today. Asset allocation, having different assets that can make you statistically reduce the amount of risk and even possibly have more wealth for your family. Families don't hire us necessarily because they want to get rich. They want to have the income they need. They want to pay less to Uncle Sam. And then third, if we can, we help them grow their wealth, but it's not at the compromise of the income plan. Without an income in retirement, there is no retirement. So asset allocation is making sure we don't necessarily just have large companies and small companies, but let's have money that's not necessarily tied to Wall Street. Alternative investments, maybe assets that are protecting you from market value adjustment. Liquidity risk. Liquidity risk is the inability to have assets readily available to meet your emergency needs. Think of a CD. Right now, we're seeing a lot of families looking for options to try to get better returns. So a lot of families might say, Joe, should we be buying a certificate of deposit from the bank? Keep in mind, a 1-year CD at the bank is going to pay us better than our cash accounts in most cases. In fact, if I tie it up for 3 or 4 years, I could even get a better return. The last thing we want to do, though, is expose too much of our money without having it liquid. Now, with that said, the other side of this is keep in mind that not all of your money needs to be available at all times either, right? So we don't necessarily have to keep it all exposed to the stock market per se. But on the other hand, let's not get so conservative or something where we're going to tie up our money or maybe buy an investment that's still exposed to market risk, like a variable annuity or something, and then still have some money locked up. So liquidity risk, it's something everybody should be addressing in their retirement planning. Again, as we go through these 14 risks here, folks, if you have a desire to schedule a 15 to 30 minute phone call, we can help you address that. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put the offer out there now. So if you'd like to schedule some time with a team member of ours to go through any of these 14 risks we're going through today, in your retirement planning, just like the pilot, we talked about the Delta pilot, you should be going through these checklists, making sure that things like liquidity risk, asset allocation risk, have you addressed it in your planning? If not, is it important to you? Not everything we're going to say is necessarily important, but you need to be able to say, I want to address this, I have addressed it, or it's not important to me with all 14 of these. Let's move on. 7, inflation risk. Inflation risk is a loss of buying power. Long-term increases in prices of goods and services that can have a significant effect on future purchasing power. The things like groceries, healthcare, long-term care, all of these kind of come into play. In fact, 7 and 8 here kind of work together, right? One of the areas we see the greatest inflation risk is around healthcare. It doesn't always seem that way, but this is a good example. Maybe 1%, 2%, 3% increases slowly over time can be an enormous amount down the road. Ronald Reagan tells us inflation is the number one. It's the stealth taxes on our future purchasing power. It's one of the nastiest things we got to work on. So we got to make sure that we address inflation and the future purchasing power. Healthcare expenses. We know that healthcare will likely go higher. Rising healthcare costs. People are losing more and more of these retirement plans. Of course, there's politicians that are talking about going to a single payer system. I personally don't think that's going to be the solution, but we need to address healthcare and healthcare risks in our retirement. So inflation, the silent killers, Ronald Reagan said, and healthcare, one of the largest areas. And then long-term care. They tell us that about 60% of all retirees should expect to pay for services associated with long-term care, chronic illnesses. Doesn't necessarily everybody's going off to the old folks' home. Maybe it's something where it's more of an assisted living type situation. It could even be just paying for somebody to come by and help you with some of the services, shoveling the drive, mowing the yard, things like that. But we all should be addressing some long-term care. One of the reasons, one of the things we want to make sure we are doing is if you become a long-term care, somebody that needs this, a lot of times long-term care isn't necessarily about, or long-term care insurance or the ways that we can protect you from long-term care isn't necessarily about trying to increase the assets or preserve assets. It's actually sometimes long-term care planning is really just giving the children permission, or somebody that's going to care for you, permission to pay for those expenses, knowing where they can take it back in a tax efficient way. So the traditional long-term care policies, like many of us have probably been told about in the past, may not necessarily mean how do we address long-term care. Long-term care might just be having a certain amount of money. If we're going to self-fund, how do we make sure that somebody has the ability to properly use that money in a tax efficient way for our care? Where do they know where to take it from? Or are they going to be forced to decide which of the investments to sell? Long-term care planning isn't necessarily long-term care insurance. It's about addressing this in your overall retirement planning so that you know what's going to happen if something ever goes wrong. Loss of spouse risk. Two things in certain in life. We always know that taxes are certain, and obviously passing on is also something that's certain. Keep in mind, think about all the things that happen when there's a loss of a spouse. A lot of times there's loss of income. Social Security for sure disappears for one of the two spouses. We may have a drop in pensions. And at the same time, we all of a sudden have an increase in taxes for the same income. Widows and widowers pay higher tax rates for the same income than a married filing joint. All of this should be addressed in your retirement planning. Ask yourself, do I feel comfortable with what's going to happen to my spouse, their taxes, their income, and what have you? Do I know that we've put something in place so that they're protected if Martians don't take me home or take me away, and I don't return home? So something to address. Again, it's not just, there's no one mutual fund that's going to protect you from this. It's about putting together true planning in your retirement. We're talking here today, 14 risks. Every one of these risks are something most of us need to look at. Number 11 is forced retirement risk. Now, if you're already retired, this is one of those risks that you're probably going to kind of look at and maybe move on. It's not going to take a lot of time to do the planning here. But if you are looking to retire in 3 or 4 years with everything going on, maybe you should start to consider what happens if I can't go through the 3 or 4 years. How am I going to bridge to healthcare early? Do I have enough money liquid set aside so that I can maintain my obligations? Definitely something that we all want to take a look at. Keep in mind that retirements are not necessarily built on assets or the money that you've saved. Successful retirement plans are built on your ability to generate income. And if you are forced to retire earlier, in fact, it's not maybe just the employer that may cut your, we've had family members that have had to retire early because of a care for a spouse or care for a child or other reasons. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your job disappears. It may be for other reasons, your own health. So let's address that. Make sure you have that included in a comprehensive plan for your retirement as you transition to retire. Public policy risk. Keep in mind, you've got a silent partner in your 401k. The name is Uncle Sam, and every time Congress meets, there's a good chance that the government is going to decide to increase their share of what that retirement plan means. It means they could increase their taxes. Quite frankly, you have nothing to do about it. What about some of these other programs that they could remove or disappear? What if we did go to a public or a single payer plan? What does that mean for your retirement? For somebody that's behind, this may be something good for them. On the other hand, if you've been a good saver, this could be an attack on you, because we know that the IRS is going to look at 1040s and tax returns, and many of us that have been better savers may end up having to absorb some of the burden there. Two more here. Unexpected financial risk. Maybe it's the kids lose their job or they have to move back home. You're helping them out. Maybe, again, it's around healthcare. Some of these are kind of more than just one. But I've found here over the last 27 years, going through all 14 of these and having a discussion is really important. Legacy risk. 80% of the families that we are able to serve, those families that we do our retirement planning, 80% of them tell us, hey, Joe, this money's for us first. If, we are going to enjoy it, we're going to take vacations, we're going to spend the money on us first. But yet we know that there's a good chance the kids are going to get something, or a family member, another loved one. Or maybe your desire is to leave money to a charity, whatever that is. Let's address that. Again, we aren't necessarily going to try to leave some dynasty trust that was built in Alaska or South Dakota, but address the legacy risk for the 10% that want to leave a whole lot more, or the 80% that just want to make sure everything goes smooth. 90% of us have to address this. There's 10% of us maybe we really don't care, and it's really just for us and whatever happens with it afterwards. But let's have a discussion. You should have a discussion with your advisor on what the legacy risk looks like and how do you want to address it. So anything here on these 14 risks, I'm going to make sure that we have the file available to you here. Let me do this. And I believe that you should have the ability to download these 14 risks. I encourage you, take this list, bring it to whoever you're working with on your own retirement planning. If it's us, bring it in the office here. Let's spend 15 to 30 minutes on a phone call. If you are not currently a client of ours and you'd like to address this with us, again, feel free to schedule a meeting. In fact, we already put that offer out there, so you can go ahead and schedule your 15 to 30 minute call with that scheduling there. With that said, I hope everybody has a great week. I hope you found some value in this today. If there are gaps in your retirement planning, again, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We want to be of service to you. We want to make sure that we are helping you out. And with that said, I hope everybody has a great rest of their week. Have a good day.